It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811 that a post-chaise drew up before the door of Aᴜᴅɪᴏ Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy, who was the only passenger, jumped out as soon as it had stopped and looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the hall door. The post-chaise had brought Stephen Elliott from Warwickshire, where some 6 months before he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aᴜᴅɪᴏ. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new and, it seemed, incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Aᴜᴅɪᴏ. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that he should even have heard of his orphan cousin. Whatever the case, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined to give his new charge a kindly reception. The moment the front door was opened, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you're not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper?" "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliott. "I'm pretty well." "That's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. "Sure it's 12? You certain?" "Yes, quite sure, sir." Well, take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parkes, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is." "Yes, sir," answered the staid Mr. Parkes, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had as yet met at Aᴜᴅɪᴏ, and they were great friends within 1/4 of an hour. Her residence at the Hall was of 20 years' standing, and consequently, if anyone knew the ins and outs of the house and district, it was Mrs. Bunch. Nor was she by any means disinclined to communicate her information. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room, reflecting on his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked. "Good?" said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as ever I see. Didn't I tell you of the little boy as he took in out the street this 7 years back? And the little girl, 2 years after I come here." No, do tell me, Mrs. Bunch, this minute." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "this little girl lived with us 3 weeks, it might be, and then one morning she got out of bed afore any of us had opened an eye, and neither track nor trace of her have I set eyes on since. Well, Master was wonderful put about, and had all the ponds dragged, but it's my belief she was had away by gypsies. Oh, dear, an odd child she was, so silent in her ways, and so domesticated she was. It was surprising." "And what of the little boy?" inquired Stephen. "Ah, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "He were a foreigner. Giovanni he called hisself, and he come in to drive one winter day, and Master had him in that minute and asked him all about where he come from and how old he was and where were his relatives, and all as kind as heart could wish. But it went the same way with him. Oh, they're an unruly lot, them foreign nations. He was off one fine morning just the same as the girl." That night Stephen had a curious dream. He found himself staring through the glazed door of a disused bathroom situated at the end of a passage at the top of the house. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. As he looked, a moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had always been considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, and that Stephen would do well to take care of himself and to shut his bedroom window at night. One Friday night in March, Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Oh, gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably. "How do you manage to tear your nightdress all to flinders this way? Oh, look here, sir, what trouble you do give to poor servants after darn and mend after you." There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits or scorings in the garment. They were confined to the left side of the chest, and Stephen was sure they were not there the night before. "But, Mrs. Bunch," he said, "they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, and I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him, open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratches can come there. It's too high up for any cat or dog to have made 'em, much less a rat. For all the world like a Chinaman's fingernails. Oh, I wouldn't say nothing to Master if I was you, my dear. Just turn the key of the door when you go to your bed." We have now arrived at March the 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day, which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people were sweeping past him on the wind, borne on resistlessly and aimlessly, vainly trying to stop themselves, to catch at something that might resist their flight and bring them back again into contact with the living world of which they had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight as late as 11 o'clock in my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future life, which is most important that you should know. You're not to mention this matter to Mrs. Bunch or to anyone else, and you better go to your room at the usual time." Here was a new excitement added to life. Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening, and saw a brazier, which he had often noticed in the corner of the room, moved out before the fire. An old silver-gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense on the brazier from a round silver box as Stephen passed, but didn't seem to notice his step. The wind had fallen, and there was a still night and a full moon. At about 10 o'clock Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom. From time to time, strange cries as of lost and despairing wanderers sounded from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or water-birds, yet they did not resemble either sound. Were they not coming nearer? Abruptly they ceased. But just as Stephen was thinking of shutting the window and resuming his reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the gravelled terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall. The figures of a boy and girl, it seemed. They stood side by side looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired him with more acute fear. Whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace and of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long, and that the light shone through them. And as he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aᴜᴅɪᴏ all evening. In another moment this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle and go down to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was at hand. The study, or library, opened out on the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged on by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. His repeated knocks were not answered. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What? Why did he try to cry out? And why was the cry choked in his throat? Had he too seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients that by enacting certain processes which to us moderns would have something of a barbaric complexity, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained. That, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of a boy, whom, to use the libellous phrase employed by the author of the Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. To the testing of the truth of this receipt, I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiment such persons as could be conveniently removed without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of a gypsy girl, the second by that of a wandering Italian lad. My final victim will be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March the 24th, 1812. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of some red wine, preferably port. The remains of the first 2 subjects at least it will be well to conceal. A disused bathroom will be found convenient for such a purpose. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound, exposing the heart. There was no blood on his hands, and a long knife on the table was perfectly clean. The window of the study was open, and it was in the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Elliott's study of the papers I have quoted led him to a very different conclusion. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811 that a post-chaise drew up before the door of Aᴜᴅɪᴏ Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy, who was the only passenger, jumped out as soon as it had stopped, brought a new and, it seemed, incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Aᴜᴅɪᴏ. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that he should even have heard of his orphan cousin. Whatever the case, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aᴜᴅɪᴏ. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import, and looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the hall door. The post-chaise had brought Stephen Elliott from Warwickshire, where some 6 months before he had been left an orphan. Now